The Creeping Horror. My father was always the most caring of men. I know many of my friends had had problems with their fathers at some point. Some were prone to drink and others were quick to anger. My father did neither of these things. He had no problems expressing his love for my mother and me. He was a jovial, gregarious man who loved life and loved those around him. He had the occasional beer or mixed drink from time to time, but never in excess. He was a very restrained and moderate man. In fact, I can only remember one time he yelled at me unfairly. I was young, 10 years old or so. I was playing with my friend Benjamin in the backyard. We lived in rural Simsbury, Connecticut. The town was surrounded by mountains and deciduous forests. We were talking about which monster would win in a fight, the tomatoes from Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, or the clowns from Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The conversation quickly burnt out when I quickly told my friend, in a matter-of-fact tone, that neither existed, so it didn't really matter. It was then that my friend turned to me and said, "Fake monsters aren't that scary. Now real monsters, they scare the bejesus out of me." I was worried that he was about to tell me a bunch of hogwash and try to scare me, but my curiosity overcame me. I had to hear more about this real monster. I paused for a moment before asking him cautiously, "Real monsters? What are you talking about?" Benjamin said, "Don't you know anything, man? Haven't you heard of the Creeping Fiend?" I answered in the negative, and he told me the story of the Creeping Horror. My friend began. "They say that there's something around these parts, that there's a creature living in the woods. My dad told me he saw it once reach down from the trees and snare a full-grown deer and pull it up into the tree and rip it apart with its bare hands. And my father would never lie to me." I asked Benjamin, "What does it look like?" "It looks like a man, but he's super skinny, like he's never eaten. He has an old gas mask on, and he wheezes heavily. I've been told he's a soldier that came back from World War II that had his lungs rotted by nerve gas. I heard that a flamethrower melted the mask to his face and can only feed by reducing his prey to a puddle and sucking up the fluids. He was unable to live amongst people, so they banished him out into the woods." Benjamin continued, "His name comes from the fact that he skulks around the woods, and no one knows he's there until you hear him wheezing right behind you. But by then it's too late. If you hear him, don't turn around because he will get you. Your best bet is to run for your life. They say he comes out to anyone who calls out his name. If you shout his name 5 times, he'll appear behind you." I was a little scared, but I knew that Benjamin was probably lying to me. I told Ben, "You're full of it. There's no such thing as the Creeping Fiend." He quickly retorted, "If I'm a liar, why don't we try calling him, you big chicken?" I was so angry at being called a coward that I momentarily lost my better judgment. I don't like to be scared, and there was a likely possibility that I would easily spook myself and send my heart racing. I called my friend out. "If I'm going to call him, then you are going to call him with me." Benjamin reluctantly agreed, and we set about calling the Creeping Horror. Unbeknownst to me, this would set off an irreversible chain of events. Benjamin and I stood facing each other just in case he would appear behind one of us. We started out in a barely audible whisper. "Creeping Horror." We paused in uncertainty before continuing a little louder. "Creeping Horror." My heart was thumping around in my chest. "Creeping Horror!" We practically shouted now. Maybe it was us doing the calling together, but I felt braver. We shouted now, "Creeping Horror!" I sucked in a deep breath to roar his name one last time, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to my house burst open, and my father flew out into the yard with a look akin to horror. mixed with another indiscernible emotion on his face. I wouldn't understand that look for many years, and when I would finally comprehend it, I would tell myself that I would give anything to not recognize it. He roared, "Stop!" Benjamin broke into a dead sprint, fearing the tone in my father's voice, essentially leaving my ass hanging out to dry. My father gripped me by both arms so hard that I thought my bones would break. He looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Never say those words again. Do you understand? Don't." I never saw my father so worked up in my entire life. At first I thought that he was mad at me for shouting. Was he angry at me for playing with Benjamin, whom my mother had called a bad influence? That was true. A few years later he would fall in with the wrong crowd and vanish off the face of the earth completely. Later it dawned on me what had incurred that fearful look in my father. He was terrified. He was horrified of the creeping horror. He knew something I didn't. Had he seen the thing with his own eyes? I decided that I needed to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't ask my dad, so I waited a couple of days when I was alone with my mom to ask if she knew anything about the creeping horror. She looked at me quizzically before responding, "It's just old folklore around here. It's just a story parents told their kids when they were younger to keep them from running off." I asked, "Did Grandpa ever tell Dad the story of the creeping horror?" She thought for a moment and said, "You know, I don't think he ever mentioned it, but probably. I could ask him if you want." I answered in the negative. I had to do some more sleuthing on my own. I lost interest for a few years. I was a kid after all and easily got distracted. 5 years would pass before my interest was renewed. I was a teenager then and was constantly in competition with my friends. We always had to prove who was the strongest, the smartest, the bravest. A few of them liked to boast that they had actually gone into the woods and at the top of their lungs called forth the creeping horror. Some embellished the story by saying they saw him and escaped, while one or two said they had actually kicked his ass. They were quickly singled out as liars. All this talk brought about a resurgence of interest in the creeping horror. I began tracking the stories back to their roots. I asked my friends where they heard the tale. Most had heard it from their parents, who had heard it from their grandparents, who in turn had heard from their great-grandparents. I caught a lucky break one day when I was talking to my friend's grandfather. He told me, "Why don't you ask your pa about all of this? He's got his own story. If the tales are true, he lost 2 of his friends when he was out playing with them." He cut himself off and said, "Old age just must have made him a gossip. Ask your father if you want the story." I tried to press the topic, but he would only respond, "Ask your father." I knew I couldn't ask my father that. I decided to do a little research at the local library. I didn't know the kids' names or whatever happened to them. I went to the library and asked the ancient librarian if she had any local papers from the 60s and 70s. She looked at me like I was a huge time sink in her otherwise busy life sitting behind a desk reading a Harlequin novel. I held my group and insisted that I be allowed to view the records. She huffed and took me back to where the microfiche was stored. A little side note, research using microfiche is in no way fun or intriguing. I wholeheartedly agree with movies opting to montage it and have someone stumble across relevant information within minutes. It took a week of going to the library after school, asking the same stuffy librarian for permission to use the microfiche, who by the end disliked me so much that her hatred was palpable, and then tirelessly looking through it for hours before I found something. I expected to come across a headline like, "Two youth mysteriously vanish," but what I found instead was much more grisly. 2 local teenagers' bodies found in woods. I read and reread the article until I was confident that this was what my friend's grandfather was talking about. The article in the newspaper discussed the discovery of 2 bodies in the woods. The bodies were badly decomposed and looked like they had been torn apart by scavengers. They were only able to identify the bodies by linking the parents' missing person reports with the discovery of the corpses. The two missing teenagers were named Alan and Justine. No leads had been discovered, but police were hopeful. The kids were the same age as my dad and had attended the same school. I exclaimed, "It has to be the creeping horror. He did this." All of a sudden, I didn't feel so alone in the back room of the library. It was as if the mere mention of his name was enough to call him to me. I quickly left the library, but the sensation of eyes watching me didn't leave until I arrived home. I wanted to talk to my dad, but I was afraid of what might happen. I didn't know what was a worse outcome. He might lose it and scream at me, or he might tell me everything. I quietly ate dinner and went up to bed. I had trouble sleeping that night. Just as I was nearing that border between sleep and the waking world, I would hear something that would snap me awake. I would hear a rasping breath that seemed to be only inches away from me. I finally decided that I had to confront my dad or find out what was making that rasping sound. To be continued, unfortunately.